Global comparison of environmental pollutant standards. India versus WHO versus USA. Presented by Dr. Fayaz Ahmad Mallah on EcoFam channel. Section 1. Introduction. Setting the stage for a global comparison. This essay compares pollution rules from three important bodies: India Central Pollution Control Board, CPCB Bureau of Indian Standards, BIS World Health Organization, WHO United States Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA. The main purpose is to understand how these organizations set limits for harmful substances in our environment. We will explore the specific numbers they use. Section 2. Why pollution standards matter. A foundation for public health. Pollution standards are a critical tool for protecting public health. These limits are set by governments and health organizations. They are not arbitrary. They are based on scientific research linking exposure to pollutants with negative health outcomes. When a country sets a limit for a substance like lead in the air, arsenic in the water, it is drawing a line. That line separates a relatively safe level from one that can cause harm. Stronger, more protective standards can reduce illness, chronic disease, and premature death. They declare a society's commitment to citizens' well-being. Standards also guide industries and local governments. Without clear limits, factories, power plants, agricultural operations might release harmful substances without restraint. Regulations give these entities a clear target. Section 3. The air we breathe. Comparing limits for PM 2.5, PM 10, and NO2. Air pollution is one of the most significant environmental threats to human health globally. Among the most dangerous air pollutants are fine particulate matter, known as PM 2.5. These are incredibly small particles, much thinner than a human hair, that can penetrate deep into the lungs and enter the bloodstream. The WHO has set a very strict annual guideline for PM 2.5 at 5 micrograms per cubic meter. The US EPA has a stricter standard than many countries, with an annual limit of 9 micrograms per cubic meter. In contrast, India's national standard, set by the CPCB, is 40 micrograms per cubic meter, which is 8 times higher than the WHO's recommended level. Another common air pollutant is PM10, which are larger, coarser particles. While not as dangerous as PM 2.5, they can still irritate the eyes, nose, and throat and contribute to respiratory problems. For PM10, the WHO recommends an annual average of no more than 15 micrograms per cubic meter. The US EPA does not have a separate annual standard for PM10, but focuses on a 24-hour standard to protect against short-term spikes. India's national annual standard for PM10 is 60 micrograms per cubic meter. Once again, this limit is significantly higher and therefore less protective than the guidelines set by the WHO, allowing for much higher concentrations of these harmful particles in the air that people breathe daily. Nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, is a toxic gas primarily released from vehicle exhaust and industrial emissions. It can cause inflammation of the airways and worsen respiratory conditions like asthma. The WHO has established a stringent annual guideline for NO2 at 10 micrograms per cubic meter. The US EPA has an annual standard of 100 micrograms per cubic meter. Section 4. Gaseous threats in the air. SO2, CO, O3, and lead. SO2, CO, O3, lead. Health effects of gaseous pollutants. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, is a pungent gas produced mainly from the burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil in power plants and industrial facilities. It can harm the respiratory system and make breathing difficult, especially for people with asthma. The WHO has a very strict guideline for short-term exposure, recommending a limit of 40 micrograms per cubic meter over a 24-hour period. The US EPA's 1-hour standard is also designed to be protective. India's 24-hour standard for SO2 is 80 micrograms per cubic meter, which is double the level recommended by the WHO. This higher limit allows for greater pollution from industrial sources, posing a higher risk to nearby communities. Carbon monoxide, CO, is a poisonous gas that is colorless and odorless. produced when fuels like gasoline and wood do not burn completely. It is a major component of vehicle exhaust. When inhaled, CO reduces the amount of oxygen that can be transported in the bloodstream, which can be very dangerous. The WHO sets a guideline for an 8-hour exposure at 10 milligrams per cubic meter. The US EPA's 8-hour standard is very similar, at 9 parts per million, which is roughly equivalent to 10 milligrams per cubic meter. India's standard for an 8-hour period is lower, at 2 milligrams per cubic meter, which appears stricter, but its 1-hour standard of 4 milligrams per cubic meter is less stringent than other international short-term guidelines. The different averaging times make direct comparison complex. Ground-level ozone, O3, is another harmful air pollutant. It is not emitted directly, but is formed when other pollutants from cars and factories react with sunlight. Ozone is a major component of smog and can damage the lungs, trigger asthma attacks, and cause other respiratory problems. The WHO recommends a peak season limit of 60 micrograms per cubic meter for O3, averaged over 8 hours. The US EPA sets its 8-hour standard at 0.070 parts per million, about 140 micrograms per cubic meter. India's 8-hour standard is 100 micrograms per cubic meter. The safety of our drinking water is governed by strict limits on its chemical and biological composition. One of the most basic parameters is pH, which measures how acidic or alkaline the water is. A pH of 7 is neutral. The WHO recommends a pH range of 6.5 to 8.5 for drinking water. This range is not based on direct health toxicity, but on preventing corrosion of pipes, which can release harmful metals, and it helps ensure the water has an acceptable taste. The US EPA has a similar non-enforceable secondary standard of 6.5 to 8.5. India's Bureau of Indian Standards also specifies the same range, from 6.5 to 8.5. On this measure, all three bodies are in agreement. Total dissolved solids, or TDS, refers to the total concentration of all minerals. While some minerals are essential for health, very high levels of TDS can give water a salty or bitter taste and may indicate the presence of other contaminants. The WHO suggests that a TDS level below 600 milligrams per liter is generally considered good. Levels above 1000 milligrams per liter are unpalatable. The US EPA has a secondary, non-enforceable guideline of 500 milligrams per liter to ensure good taste. India's Bureau of Indian Standards sets a desirable limit of 500 milligrams per liter, but allows a permissible limit of up to 2000 milligrams per liter, where no other water source is available. That's a much higher, less protective ceiling. Some substances in water are toxic even at very low concentrations, requiring extremely strict limits. Fluoride, naturally occurring element. In small amounts, it helps prevent tooth decay. Excessive exposure can cause dental fluorosis. Excessive exposure can cause staining of teeth. In severe cases, it causes skeletal fluorosis, a painful bone disease. WHO guideline, 1.5 mg per liter. US EPA enforceable limit, 4.0 mg per liter. India acceptable limit, 1.0 mg per liter. India permissible limit, 1.5 mg per liter. India's acceptable limit here is stricter than WHO and US EPA, reflecting local health risks. Arsenic, highly toxic metalloid contaminating groundwater. Long-term exposure causes skin lesions, cancer, and other serious problems. WHO provisional guideline, 10 micrograms per liter, that's 0.001 milligrams per liter. US EPA standard, 10 micrograms per liter. India acceptable standard, 10 micrograms per liter. Previously, where hard to achieve, a permissible limit of 50 micrograms per liter was allowed. Lead, toxic metal leaching from old pipes and fixtures. No safe level, especially harmful to children's brain development. WHO provisional guideline, 10 micrograms per liter for lead. US EPA lead and copper rule action level, 15 micrograms per liter. India acceptable limit, 10 micrograms per liter, aligning with WHO and stricter in principle than the US EPA action level. Regulating soil pollution is more complex than air or water standards often depend on the type of land use: agricultural, residential, industrial. For heavy metals, the WHO provides guidance on safe levels in food crops, and the FAO also provides guidance on safe levels in food crops. They don't usually set direct limits for soil itself. However, the US EPA sets soil quality guidelines, and authorities in India set their own soil quality guidelines. Cadmium is a toxic metal that can damage the kidneys. The US EPA sets strict cleanup levels for cadmium in residential soils, often around 70 milligrams per kilogram. India's cadmium standards can vary and are sometimes higher than US EPA levels. Chromium is another metal of concern. Hexavalent chromium is the highly toxic form. It is a known carcinogen. The US EPA has developed very strict risk-based screening levels for hexavalent chromium in residential soil, sometimes as low as 0.28 milligrams per kilogram. Standards for total chromium are higher. In India, standards for chromium are often specified for total chromium and can be less stringent. The differences in pollution standards have profound health and environmental implications. When the WHO recommends a PM2.5 limit of 5 micrograms per cubic meter, it is based on extensive evidence linking exposure above this level to higher rates of heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, respiratory infections. A country that adopts a less strict standard, such as 40 micrograms per cubic meter, is implicitly accepting a higher burden of these diseases. A limit of 10 micrograms per liter for arsenic is designed to minimize the risk of cancer and other debilitating health effects from long-term exposure. Even with a strict rule on paper, a lack of investment in water treatment facilities, pipe maintenance, regular testing means that people will continue to be exposed to harmful contaminants like lead and bacteria. From an environmental perspective, pollution limits are crucial for preserving ecosystems. Investing in cleaner technologies and stronger regulations is not a burden on the economy. It is an investment in a healthier, more sustainable, and more prosperous future. This comparative analysis of pollution standards has revealed a clear and consistent pattern. In conclusion, who is the most stringent for most air and water pollutants? The US EPA often leads on legally binding regulations and soil cleanup, and India's standards lag behind these international benchmarks in many areas.